Emily and I had been discussing moving for a long time. The old city had become cramped, the house was small and a bit rundown. We wanted to start from scratch, leaving behind the routine and familiar streets. The new city seemed like a breath of fresh air, spacious, modern, with prospects. The realtor sent me several house options via email, and one of them immediately caught my attention. It was a 2-story house with a white facade and large windows that hid a huge yard. I showed the photo to Emily, and she just smiled and said, "That's him." No hesitation, no doubts, this house was like the realization of our dreams. The move went quickly and without any difficulties. We packed our things in boxes, ordered a truck, and a few days later we were standing outside our new home, enjoying the thought of how we would furnish every corner. Emily immediately started making plans. Which rooms should be renovated first, where we would put the furniture, what colors would dominate. She's always had great taste, so I trusted her with this part, while I was more concerned with the technical issues. Over the next few weeks, our house turned into a construction site. We slept on mattresses in the living room, while workers plastered the walls and painted the ceiling. But every day our home became more and more cozy. New floors, a modern kitchen, a large fireplace in the living room, everything was starting to take shape. We paid special attention to the yard. We had a lot of space that we wanted to make the best use of. I dreamed of green lawns, comfortable places to relax and barbecue. But Emily had other plans. She often talked about how she wanted to create a real oasis, a place where you could enjoy nature, flowers, and tranquility. She suggested hiring a landscaper to make everything look perfect. I didn't argue. If it brings her joy, then so be it. To be honest, I began to participate less in our common affairs. My work required more and more attention, and after the move, the yard project became a real passion for Emily. She would spend hours flipping through magazines, looking for ideas on the internet, and sharing with me photos of gardens and yards that seemed perfect to her. But my reaction was often indifferent. I just nodded my head, saying, "Do as you wish." I didn't feel much need to do anything about it, even though I knew it was important to Emily. One day, she found a designer who was praised in local groups. His name was Brian, and he came to us for a consultation the following week. Young, about 35, with a light tan and confidence in his every move, he showed up in our backyard, hung with tape measures, notebooks, and stone samples. His eyes swept over our yard, and he immediately started to express ideas. "Here we need to add some tall trees for shade, and over there," he pointed to a corner near the terrace, "we can make a recreation area with a fountain or a small pond. This will add natural harmony to the space." Emily was eager to hear his suggestions. They stood together by the terrace and discussed the details, which plants were best suited for our climate, which materials to use for paving. Her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as Brian described the future look of our yard. "What do you think?" she asked as they approached me, waving the blueprints enthusiastically. I looked at the plans, but my opinion didn't matter much anymore. I just smiled and nodded. "It looks great," I said. "The main thing is that you like it. I just want us both to be comfortable here," she said, but I was already far away in my mind, thinking about the next work call. Over the next few weeks, Brian became a regular visitor to our home. He would arrive every morning with a team of workers, supervise the process, and often stay until late at night. I noticed him and Emily spending more and more time together. Their conversations were no longer limited to the garden. They were laughing, joking, discussing movies, and traveling. Every time I walked by, they would stop talking and pretend to continue discussing the details of the project. But I didn't care. I trusted Emily, and I didn't even think about possible problems. I was too focused on work and everyday life to notice how the distance between us was growing. When one of my colleagues invited me to lunch, I accepted, not even thinking that it had been a long time since I had spent time with Emily. It seemed to me that we both had so much to do now that it was normal we were just going through a phase. She takes care of the house, and I take care of my career. It was a kind of division of responsibilities. But Brian began to come home more often, even on days when his crew was already finished. Something in my heart started to feel uneasy, but I pushed it down, thinking it was just a normal work interaction. However, I noticed them growing more and more distant from me. I couldn't see anything obvious, but I could feel it like a slight vibration in the air that warned of a storm about to break out. Every day, the tension between Emily and me grew. It was silence. A cold, alienated silence that lay between us like an invisible barrier. We no longer spoke the way we used to. When she sat down next to me at breakfast, I just nodded at her words, thinking about work. When I came home late, she might not even look up from her book or laptop. We lived under the same roof, but in different worlds. One evening, after another late return, I noticed that Emily was no longer sleeping, but sitting on the couch, hugging her knees and staring at the floor. She looked tired and distant, as if she had been waiting for me for months instead of a few hours. "You were at work again until the night?" Her voice was quiet, but I could hear fatigue and frustration in it. "Yes, I had a few important meetings," I answered, trying to avoid direct eye contact. "And so every day," she sighed. "Don't you care about what's happening here in our lives?" I wanted to answer that I was doing all this for us, for our future. That I work so that we can afford this house, this renovation, this garden. But the words got stuck in my throat, because deep inside I realized that her question was not about money. "It's hard for me to explain, but I feel lonely," she continued. "I've tried to involve you in everything, the renovations, the landscape, our plans. But you are always somewhere else. You're physically close, but emotionally, you're far away." I couldn't find the right words to reassure her, even though I was burning inside with shame and helplessness. She was right. I really didn't pay attention to her feelings because I thought everything was fine as long as I fulfilled my role as provider and protector. But I had forgotten about the other things, about her emotional needs, about her support, about the simple moments of intimacy that once united us. Instead of recognizing my mistakes, I just responded, "You know how much work there is. This is temporary. Everything will be fine soon." Emily did not answer. She just smiled bitterly, turned away from me, and went upstairs, leaving me sitting in the dark. At that moment, I didn't realize how deep her loneliness was and how much it broke her. I continued to live in my own rhythm, not even realizing that every day we spent together was the last step towards the irreversible. Over the next few days, Emily began to disappear more often. She could spend the whole day somewhere outside the house, and only return in the evening, looking relaxed and almost happy. I explained that she was working on a landscape project. Brian continued to come to our house. He was working on the garden, showing up every morning. Their conversations became more than just discussing the project. Every time I came home and saw them together, I felt a strange sense of anxiety, but I brushed it off. I was reassured by the thought that it was just their job. I trust Emily, after all. And yet, this silence between us did not disappear. The neighbor across the street, George, sometimes gave me long looks when I drove up to the house. One day he asked me cautiously, "How are things at home? I see the landscape looks beautiful." I just laughed, not attaching any importance to his words. I did not know then that George had seen more than I was ready to realize. One evening, when I was returning from work later than usual, I received a call from George, the neighbor from across the street. We weren't close friends, but we would occasionally exchange a few words when we met in the yard or at the supermarket. His call at such a late hour surprised me. "Hi," he began, his voice tense. Listen, I don't know if I should tell you this, but I think you should know. I frowned, feeling anxiety brewing somewhere inside me. What do you mean? I asked, slowing my pace toward my house. I saw your wife this afternoon. He paused, as if considering the best way to say it. She wasn't alone. I noticed that Brian came by when you were gone. And you know what I saw through the window? It didn't look like a discussion of the landscape. I stopped talking. Every word he said was like a hammer on glass that was about to break. I stood in front of the house, looking at the dark windows. My hand involuntarily clenched the keys, and my fingers grew cold. What do you want to say, George? My voice sounded hoarse and uncertain, as if I was afraid to hear the answer. I'm sorry to pry, but I saw them together in the bedroom. It looked like they were, well, you know. I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe I'm just exaggerating, but now you know. I was silent, trying to collect my thoughts. Everything George had said was like puzzles starting to come together in my head. Emily's alienation, her sudden disappearance, her frequent meetings with Brian. It was all there on the surface, but I didn't want to see it. Or I couldn't. Thank you, George. I barely said, not knowing what else to say. I hung up the phone but didn't move. I stood outside, in the dark, and stared at our home, which now seemed alien to me. Behind these walls that we had created together, there was a truth that I didn't want to admit. I opened the door and entered the house. It was quiet. Too quiet. Emily was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching TV, but when she saw me, her face tensed. Hi. She tried to smile, but her eyes betrayed her unease. We need to talk. I said it dryly, trying to keep my composure, even though I was seething inside. About you and Brian. Her face suddenly changed. She was no longer trying to hide the truth. Her eyes filled with tears, but there was no sense of remorse. Rather, they were tears of relief that this moment had finally come. Yes, she said quietly, lowering her head. It's true. My hands trembled, and I sat down in a chair, feeling as if the floor was leaving my feet. Why? Was the only word that came out of me like my last breath. Emily looked at me with sad eyes full of fatigue and disappointment. You didn't listen to me, you didn't see me. I was right next to you, but at the same time I was alone. You didn't pay attention to me for months. I tried, Carl. I really tried to save our marriage. But you haven't been with me for a long time. Brian, he understood me. He saw me in a way that you haven't seen me in a long time. Her words cut me, leaving deep wounds. I thought I was building a solid future for us, working nonstop, providing everything we wanted. But in that moment, I realized that I had lost what was most important, our emotional intimacy. So what now? I asked, trying to collect my thoughts. Are you going to go to him? She nodded silently, swallowing her tears. I can't live like this anymore, Carl. We're not together anymore. This is just a formality. I'm going to see Brian. These words finally broke me. My world, which had seemed so stable and orderly, was falling apart right before my eyes. The divorce was a cold and emotionless process. Emily and I decided that there was no point in delaying. She had already made her choice, and I didn't have the strength to fight or object. Together we went to the lawyers and drew up all the necessary documents. I convinced myself that this was the best way out. We avoided conflicts, avoided mutual accusations. Everything was emphatically calm, although my feelings were boiling inside. The house that I had invested so much time and effort in was now hers. I could have insisted on dividing the property or selling it, but at that moment it didn't seem to matter. Emily stayed with Brian. It seemed only fair to leave her with what had become her new life. I simply packed my things, said goodbye to the place that was to become our home together, and left. At that moment, I couldn't stay there any longer among the memories that now felt like ghosts of a former happiness. The divorce process took several months. We didn't communicate much, only official meetings with lawyers, signatures on documents. At the beginning of this journey, I thought that I might be able to get her back, that our chances were not lost. But every day I realized that there was nothing left between us that could unite us. She had already chosen another life, and I had to accept it. When the divorce was finally finalized, I received an email with the court's decision. It was a formality, but this formality marked the end of a whole stage of my life. I sat on the floor in my new, small apartment and looked at the computer screen. It was the very mundane ending I had never expected. Now I was alone. Time was passing. Life moved on, although after the divorce, the feeling of emptiness did not leave me for a long time. I tried to immerse myself in work, to fill my day with things that would distract me from thinking about the past. But most of all, I was tormented by questions. When did everything go wrong? Could I have changed anything? Over time, I realized that the answer was obvious. I allowed myself to become distant, closed in my problems and career, ignoring my wife's needs. I thought that stability and material comfort were the foundation of a marriage. But it was only part of the equation. Emotional support, spending time together, talking, all of this was important, but I hadn't noticed it. Emily was right, although it was painful to accept. I had been immersed in my work, neglecting her, forgetting that she needed not only financial support, but also simple attention, love, and intimacy. The loss of this intimacy led her to find these things elsewhere. And although it was hard for me to admit, I was also to blame for our divorce. This situation taught me an important lesson. Love is not just about sharing a home or financial stability. It is about constant work on the relationship, communication, and listening to each other. It's important to remember that you can't let work or everyday life get in the way between people who love each other. Now I am alone, but this experience has made me wiser. I will never allow myself to make the same mistakes again. And if I ever get a chance to build a new relationship, I will do everything I can to make sure that this closeness never disappears again.